No, you're not. Yeah.
Radio Free Intimate, episode 283, and this time around we're talking about one of the most important bands as far as my history of being into extreme metal goes. That's right, it's everybody's favorite purveyors of ithyphalic death metal. The Egyptian-themed death metal titans, Nile, of Greenville, South Carolina. The band that you don't see discussed as much nowadays as you used to, and when people do talk about them, as far as I can tell, they're missing the point entirely.
You've been duped, you've been had, you've been bamboozled about the truth.
Or at least the reasons that a lot of people listen to Nile don't really line up with my reasons for listening to them at all. So if you're more of an old school death metaler and you've kind of left Nile out of your death metal lexicon due to their association with more modern trends and tech death or whatever, don't click off this particular piece of content because I might be able to change your mind about them.
What'd I tell you? Hold on to your cock when you negotiate with these desert people.
So when I was initially getting into metal in my early teens, I wasn't really into like horror movies or gore or any of that kind of stuff. That all came later after I'd been into death metal for a while. As a kid, I was way more into science fiction, fantasy, mythology, and history. And if you know anything about Nile's lyrical topics, you could see why they might be a perfect entry point for a personage such as myself getting into death metal. Because they're all about that ancient Egyptian history, and they're also all about the Clark Ashton Smith and the H.P. Lovecraft stuff, which I was already getting into at the time, particularly stories such as The Nameless City.
It must have been thus before the first stones of Memphis were laid, and whilst the bricks of Babylon were yet unbaked. There is no legend so old as to give it a name, or to recall that it was ever alive, but it is told of in whispers around campfires and muttered about by grandams in the tents of sheikhs, so that all the tribes shun it without wholly knowing why.
And The Outsider.
Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nephron-Khan, the sealed and unknown valley of Hadoth by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any deity save the unnamed feasts of Nectaurus beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage.
And I know how much all you edgy goofballs love that weirdo and his cat. Musically, it seems like Nile often gets associated with the beginning of what I might call the bean counter death metal movement. You know, death metal for nerds! You know, their songs are at such and such high BPM. The guitarist is using such and such scale, doing these crazy split picking things, and the drummer's all... How many snare hits can I fit in the gravity blast, blah, blah, whatever. Not really what I'm looking for in my death metal, and probably why a lot of more old school minded folks tend to turn up their nose at Nile. However, at least as far as the Nile albums that I really enjoy go, this is a gross misrepresentation of what Nile's all about. Nile actually have a whole lot of roots in more classical heavy metal stuff, going way back to the 1980s, with 3 of Nile's original members being in a band called Moria, who I often see characterized as more of a thrash metal, speed metal kind of band, but in my ears, they have just as much in common with a lot of classic doom metal like Candlemass and Trouble. And even way back in 1987, they were all about odd tempo shifts and different sections in their music being blocked off, something that would definitely follow them into Nile, as well as a pretty potent sense of groove, which you're hearing right now. That would be very important for very early Nile. And I do mean early, because a lot of people don't realize the first Nile demo is from 1994, and it has a very strange, unique style, very different to what your stereotypical Nile song sounds like in the death metal collective consciousness nowadays. That said, a lot of Nile's trademark aesthetic touches were already in place. You got these wailing guitars from Carl Sanders, the kind of tribal drumming, the very thick guitar sound, and the very obvious usage of harmonic minor and Middle Eastern sounding melodies in the riffs. I've seen a lot of people accuse this very early Nile stuff of not even really being death metal, more of a groove thrash thing. To my ears, it's still pretty death metal. We'll split the difference, call it death thrash maybe. That doesn't really account for the potent amount of doom metal groove going on here. And while the drums might not be as blasting as they were later on, the shuddering walls of tremolo pit guitar that would be all over later Nile were already very much in effect at this point in their career.
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고.
Okay, yeah, fine, maybe I cheated a little bit by choosing to play a sample of by far the heaviest song on that demo. But give me a break, it's my favorite song, and I think it shows off the bridge and the gap between the very early heavy classic metal stuff they had going on back in the 80s and the death metal stuff they would partake in going forward. And partake in such things they did when they got around to the Festivals of Atonement album, which I would say is probably the earliest earliest Nile release that most people have heard. The shorter tracks on this mini album showed off their transition to much more fast and brutal death metal stuff, but my personal favorite songs on this are all the longer ones, which go even heavier on the really crushing doom sort of atmosphere. Later Nile material is of course famous for its very acrobatic technical drumming, but I think there's really something special going on with Pete Hamura's earlier work that has this very primitive tribal feeling to it that fits the ancient Egyptian atmosphere quite nicely and bolsters that sort of heavy groove thrash that was very much a part of their initial demo. The riffs on Festival's Atonement in general and this song Rot in particular are also notable in my ears for being rather catchy, which is probably a major part of why Nile was one of the first death metal bands I got into. Despite its esoteric veneer, Nile's music is relatively easy to follow for a beginning listener. And there's clean vocals that then transition into harsher, more standard death growls, or in this case more of a death shout. It sounds really cool, and unfortunately they kind of dropped these particular vocal stylings after this album for the most part. One thing they never dropped, however, was this absolutely subterranean style of groove riffing, as well as the incorporation of some rather controversial, overtly ancient Egyptian cinematic sounding elements like these keyboards right here. For a lot of people, this kind of stuff is a sticking point for why they can't get into Nile. They say it's inserted a little too randomly and it slows the song down, takes away from the death metal. However, in this case, I disagree, because that melody is very well integrated into the overall death metal, as evidenced by how easily the guitars then pick up on that same melody as sort of a counterpoint response to it. That first Nile demo, I think it's awesome, but I could see why most people might consider it to be more of a curiosity. But Festivals of Atonement, that's just some classic death metal, dude. I mean, I first started downloading MP3s off of LimeWire when I was like 12 or 13 or some shit, and I haven't got tired of it since then. Given how notoriously picky I am with my death metal listening habits, that should be a ringing endorsement. That's right! That's right! And with that, we get into the second era of Nile, which I would consider to be the dawning of modern day Nile. We're talking 1997, 1998, the Ramses Bringer of War EP, and the Amongst the Catacombs of Nephron full length, which, I mean, they share songs with each other. It's essentially the same style. I don't feel too bad about lumping them together.
You have a problem with that? You know what you should do? You should sanction me. Sanction me with your army. Oh, wait a minute. You don't have an army.
This era of Nile is particularly important in terms of overall death metal history, because this is one of the only examples I can think of where you got this guy that was a classic 80s metal personage of sorts, making the jump to not just death metal, but bleeding edge for the time, brutalist of the brutal, fastest of the fast sort of death metal. It'd be like if Leif from Candlemass all of a sudden ended up putting an album that sounded like Cryptopsy. I mean, listen to how quickly the transitions between riffs hit here, facilitated by how much more brutal the drumming is this time around. And yet it's not as spastic as it seems on the surface. It's actually all very well composed, where each little micro phrase will have hints of what came before, as well as predictive hints of what's coming up. It might take a few listens to figure out everything that's going on, but rest assured, this stuff is actually very musically coherent, despite its overtly chaotic aesthetic. And perversely, it is still rather catchy sounding, very memorable kind of stuff. Here comes one of those really weird transitions, where they increase the tension of the music by hanging on this particular phrase before exploding into a really nasty blast beat riff. They're very effective at utilizing these sorts of stops and starts in a way that seems very musical rather than just being spastic and kind of gotcha.
We got you.
One of the scant few death metal bands capable of doing so. I'd put them up there with Suffocation in that regard. That song, Howling of the Djinn, was kind of their first attempt at that sort of really fast, brutal, neck-breaking sort of death metal. First track on the Ramses Bringer of War demo. When you get to the Amongst the Catacombs of Nephron full length, you get a whole bunch of tracks that are very much within that mold, but also incorporate a whole lot more of their trademark cinematic ancient Egyptian atmospheric touches.
What are you gonna do, Yugi? Send me to the Shadow Realm?
Shadow Realm? No, Kaiba, I'm sending you to the Bronx!
A lot of these riffs don't even necessarily blast as much as they kind of churn, spiraling off into the ends of these ethnic scales played in the death metal context. It almost has just as much in common with a lot of the faster blasting sort of black metal as it does with proper death metal, at least until you hit parts like this sort of very early Cryptopsy stop-start sort of transition. This build-up right here is one of the best moments of early Nile. Real catchy, chugging New York death metal style riff leading into a chaotic swirling mass of screams and this all over the place lead guitar. Very Trey Azekthos sounding. And as I mentioned on episode 278, Carl Sanders and Trey have had a long-running artistic correspondence. Anyways, now we're getting some keyboards. And again, it reminds me a lot of black metal, almost kind of early Emperor, where the keyboards are more used just as an accenting voice as opposed to something driving the composition. There are a few tracks spread out across both the Ramses Bringer of War demo and the Amongst of Catacombs of Nephren Ka LP that go full bore with the atmospherics, entirely leaving the death metal behind. And honestly, I think they do just as good a job of setting that sort of savage atmosphere as the death metal proper does. One of the best songs in this regard appears on both the Ramses Bringer of War demo and the album, that being the mouthful titled Die Rache Krieg Lied der Assyri. The broken German title might piss some people off, but it's in keeping with the Clark Ashton Smith H.P. Lovecraft theme. Anybody remember Unaussprechlichen Kulten? Regardless of any possible grammatical errors, I definitely enjoy the different vocal styles being utilized simultaneously and the layering of keyboard sounds. Real cool sort of palate cleanser between the bits of death metal fury. And with that, we have now breached the perimeter of what I like to call my era of Nile. The era of Nile that I heard first and the one that got me into them, and the one that really jumps out in my head when I think of the band Nile. So after the Amongst the Catacombs album, Pete Hamora, the drummer, ended up leaving the band due to a foot injury he sustained on tour, and original vocalist, bassist Chief Spires kind of started to dramatically scale back his involvement with the band, and it sort of turned into the Carl Sanders and Dallas Toller Wade show, featuring the drumming talents of any death metal celebrity fast enough to keep up with them.
우리 동아리 실세는 바로
Nobody cares about the bass playing in Nile. For whatever reason, it's this era of Nile that tends to be looked upon most harshly by Nile's rather vociferous critics. A lot of people really seem to hate Black Seeds of Vengeance and In Their Darkened Shrines. Why?
Because they're stupid, that's why.
As far as more modern death metal goes, these two Nile albums are some of the best examples of the genre. The first of these featured Derek Roddy on drums, who you might remember from Malevolent Creation, Hate Eternal, Aurora Borealis, whole lot of bands. You got great heavy songs on it, like the wonderfully titled Masturbating the War God.
As a dude, if you masturbate with no lube and you jerk your dick too hard or too fast, you can literally cause your dick to get a chafe burn from masturbating too hard. And it forms what I like to call wanker scab.
Derek Roddy, as a drummer, is very famous for his highly technical application of tom rolls. It's interesting how the guitars link up with this, choosing to insert their trademark scale runs almost directly in sync with whenever Derek does a drum fill. It actually ignites sort of an interesting chicken and the egg kind of debate, where did they already have the songs written to do this sort of thing, and then they figured Derek Roddy would just be the best man for the job, or given that they got the fill master Derek Roddy in the band, they decided to insert more of these little quick scale runs to match the drum fill. Either way, it creates this interesting sort of liquid bending effect to the riffs that really enhances the fluid nature of the constant tempo shifts. And as you're hearing right now, it's not all just fast blasting brutal stuff. It's still got plenty of that sort of atmospheric doomy tone. The demarcations between the two different styles being aggressively emphasized by the coupled guitar shredding and drum fills. Again, a lot of people accuse this sort of thing of being spastic or disjointed, but I don't really hear it. It all seems very well composed to me. It's just composed in a very extreme way. Almost like it's fucking death metal or something.
Stop getting comfy.
The percussion almost takes on sort of an orchestral role, often dropping out or just marking out notes before coming back in when the tremolo picking picks back up. More of these like rolling, slow blast beats. Constant sort of push-pull dynamic, very noticeable during the atmospheric sections of even the most brutal songs. And speaking of atmosphere, one of my favorite songs on this album, The Black Flame, goes full-on melding that sort of atmospheric soundscape kind of thing with a more death metal approach to songwriting. The song starts out very much in Nile's signature ambient interlude sort of mode, gradually layering sounds to create dramatic tension before the metal actually explodes outward. And when it does, it's not even initially in a death metal mode. It's almost more of a throwback to the doomy stylings of the Festivals of Atonement EP. Again, I've seen a lot of criticisms of Derek Roddy's drumming on this album being nothing but a bunch of spazzy nonsense. And again, I can't really hear it. It sounds pretty subtle here. Very orchestral, sort of symphonic kind of thing. When death metal comes, it explodes like an airbag in a car accident, hitting you with some very frenetic but also surprisingly consonant melodic musical phrases, giving off almost sort of a melodic black metal kind of feeling. Rather unusual for Nile, but that's why I like this song so much. It teeters on the edge of chaotic collapse with these scale runs before plummeting back to earth, hitting another doomy sort of riff. Very weird, but intelligently structured song. Not really in lockstep with the spazcore that was popular within the larger death metal scene at the time at all. And when people accuse Nile of partaking in such stuff on these two albums, they really need to get their ears and their memories checked.
Stop getting cooked.
Despite the fact that Derek Roddy fit Nile's sound perfectly, he really did this album as more of a session musician. And on the follow-up album, they got another celebrity drummer, this time Tony Laureano, who, like Derek Roddy, was in Aurora Borealis, but was also in a whole shitload of other bands, most notably Angel Corpse and 1349 to my estimation. He's got his own style too. Like Derek Roddy's, it's very heavy on fills, but he puts more of an emphasis on really creative cymbal work, particularly on the fast songs on In Their Darkened Shrine, such as Wind of Horrors. This one starts out with an interesting two-part counterpoint. Here's part one, and here's part two. You got the push-pull going on between these choppier musical phrases and these sort of long flowing ones with that weird Middle Eastern keyboard effect. The difference between each underscored by Tony's drumming, before it then jumps into this sort of like descending, almost thrashy kind of riff with a really show-offy sort of technical tail to it, with all these guitar arabesques and flourishes. Really love the production on this album with that super dry, almost thin drum sound. It has a decent amount of snap to it, contrasting very interestingly with the very cavernous guitar tone. Earlier on I made the joke nobody gives a shit about bass in Nile. I was only half kidding, because good luck friggin' hearing the bass guitar through that gigantic tsunami wall of low-pitched noise. The fast and brutal songs like Wind of Horus were definitely the most technical and brutal stuff that Nile had recorded to date, but at the same time they brought back a lot of that older groove influence on some of the slower songs, many of which feature melodies that if you're feeling charitable are rather fun and exotic, and if you're a bit of more of a sourpuss, they almost verge on the corny, or at the very least campy, including the first Nile song I ever heard that made me like them, Sarcophagus. This one starts out with one of the most stereotypical sort of Hollywood sounding evil Egyptian death metal riffs ever, but I still kind of enjoy it, and it's got an interesting little harmony towards the melodic end of it. But this shit really gets good when it kicks into the main groove riff, which features a lot of cool string bending and sort of this weird bassy chug to it, really taking advantage of that down tuning to make the guitar as heavy as possible. And when the lyrics kick in, you really get a sense for this song's very noticeable narrative flow, very much hearkening back to the earliest days of Nile, which is part of why I enjoy this era of Nile so much, because it's kind of the weirdest and most out there they ever got, and at the same time you can hear all these bridges back to even their demo days. They've also done a really good job of incorporating a lot of those more outside of death metal influences into their slower songs in this album, perhaps most notably in the 4-part In Their Darkened Shrine suite that closes the album. However, my favorite example of this would have to be the 12-minute long behemoth that ends side 1 of the album, Unas, Slayer of the Gods, which features some melodies that might sound very familiar to more classical scholars of heavy metal. Do you recognize them?
정적이어가지고.
That's right, quite a few of this song's main melodic themes are taken from the Candlemass song Well of Souls. This actually isn't the first time Nile has sort of remixed another artist's work in their own inimitable ithophallic style. Their very early song Ramses Bringer of War was actually a reimagining of Gustav Holst's Mars the Bringer of War from way back in 1917. However, I think Unas, Slayer of the Gods does a much more interesting thing utilizing Candlemass's music. For one, it connects to Nile's sort of epic heavy doom metal roots, but also despite taking some of its melodies from the Candlemass song, it's pretty much its own unique structure. In fact, if you hadn't heard Candlemass, you just heard this Nile song, you'd probably assume these were all standard Nile melodies. Indeed, I actually heard this before I heard Candlemass, and that's what helped me get into Candlemass way back in the day. Also, this song does a really interesting job presaging a lot of Carl Sanders' solo work outside of Nile, which I would also highly recommend if you're into the more ethnic Egyptian sounding parts of Nile, or just stuff like Dead Can Dance or Arcana. Lyrically, it's also an interesting contrast with Candlemass's original song, which lyrically was very Christian in outlook, whereas Unas the Slayer of the Gods, directly utilizing translations of the pyramid texts, is almost sort of a Bronze Age proto-Nietzschean diatribe involving the titular Unas gaining power by consuming the gods themselves. Kind of a Twilight of the Idols sort of thing mixed with the concept of overcoming. After this album, Nile would get a much more stable lineup featuring George Colias on drums. And if you were to ask a sampling of modern day Nile fans, that's when Nile got good, you know, Annihilation of the Wicked onward. Me,
It is what it is.
I'm more into that super catchy, early kind of groove thrash doom metal stuff, and then the absolute bonkers blend of styles they had going on their first 3 full lengths. But no matter where you stand on the Nile question, I think you gotta admit, they're a pretty solid band, dude. But hey, that's just one man's opinion, and thank you for listening to it. Tune in next time for some more stuff.
I want to apologize to my girlfriend because I don't fool around on the road.
Because he's just a tour rat, right here, tour rat, you know.
That makes me mad!
Hey, we're out of here. We gotta go. We gotta go out to Brooklyn. We gotta play right now, okay? See you later.